Now then, the US President Joe Biden and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson have warned that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is still very much a possibility.
Right. Today, Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is meeting his NATO counterparts as they attempt to avert the possible conflict. He joins us now live from Brussels. Good morning to you. Thanks very much for joining us this morning. I mean, we know that Russia's been talking about concluding training exercises, sending troops back. Have you seen any evidence of this withdrawal? What's the current threat at the moment?
Well, we haven't been able to verify the latest claims, and we will do that both through intelligence and observation of it. If it is, it would be welcome. As of yesterday, we were actually seeing an increase of forces in other parts of the border region. We saw field hospitals being constructed. We have seen yesterday Russian troops and the day before move from assembly areas to more sort of forward mounting areas. So that was all in the wrong direction if we were going to de-escalate. And, you know, we reached a stage yesterday where the overwhelming size of the Russian armed forces was now at a level, if they wished to invade, they would have significant forces to do so. And that was, you know, they had over 60 battalion tactical groups available, I think nearly 100 of them actually, around the borders, and lots of ships at sea as well.
OK, so what's the likelihood then? What's your assessment of the likelihood of an attack still now? Because according to US intelligence, of course, we thought we would have one just a mere few hours ago.
No, I mean, just to make sure that the US position was that from the 15th of February, they believed the forces would be significant to mount an invasion should President Putin wish to do so. That's correct. They were off that scale and deployment to do so. I think what I would say is, and I've been quite consistent, we still don't think President Putin has made a final decision. Certainly, the disposition of the forces are not normal exercising forces. You know, I was in the army in North Germany in the days of the Cold War, or just after the Cold War, and you know, you don't set up all those hospitals and deploy huge amounts of live weapon systems in the way they've been deployed for just an exercise. So I think President Putin is in a position where he has a choice. We worry about his stated aims for Ukraine, which he wrote last July. And that's why we're all engaged, both at NATO and as bilateral nations, in trying to de-escalate the problem and involve both diplomatic dialogue, but also deterrence.
Well, speaking with your military strategic hat on, I mean, it's a given, isn't it, if you look back at history, that when you have a build-up of a military force on the border of one country and the next, and it configures itself into an attack position, which is what's happened here now in Russia, hence all the warnings from Joe Biden and from Boris Johnson, there comes a point where it just develops its own momentum, and it's very, very difficult to stop it happening. Do you think we're very close to that point now?
I think we are always in danger, as you rightly say, Richard, of miscalculation, or indeed, as you say, a sort of false start. And that would be catastrophic and tragic for the people of Ukraine and indeed the people of Russia. And that's why what we try and do is through a strong diplomatic messaging and talk to the Russians to effectively reassure, but also provide proper lines of communications. We develop that. That's why I went to Moscow for the first time in about 30 years as a defense secretary to see my Russian counterpart, was to make sure we had clear lines of communications to deconflict and de-escalate. But it's also why we deploy or make available to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, that's the lead NATO general, forces at readiness, so very quick deployment, should they need to be deployed, to provide reassurance for those countries on the border who would suffer as a result. And it's a bit of both. It's deterrent and it's diplomatic reassurance and clear lines of communications, because you are totally right, Richard. We do not want miscalculation and something to go off by mistake.
What is deeply surprising, really, is that Putin is still considering doing this, because it would be mad, wouldn't it? If he were to invade, he doesn't have nearly enough troops to hold the country, as they say. He's got enough to maybe encircle the capital for a while. He would clearly face very, very stiff resistance in a very large country, which, as I say, he couldn't hold. The sanctions would be brutal. I mean, he'd have to be politically insane to do this.
Well, I think I'm not going to make a judgment on his state of mind, but I think, look, you're right, Richard. But if you read, he wrote this long article last July, and we know he wrote large parts of it himself. He has a very clear historical view of the people of Ukraine and Russia, and that somehow this is really a conspiracy against their desire to be united as one people of the ancient Rus, as he calls them. And if you read it, it's an exercise in ethnic nationalism, which you and I know in our lifetime has witnessed horrendous conflicts in the Balkans, etc., and indeed before our lifetimes in the wartime period. But it's quite a read. It's a long read, but it is a worrying place to be. And if that's what he really does believe, and he did write it, then it worries us for the future, which is why NATO needs to get together. This is a scheduled meeting today and tomorrow. We have 2 days of defence ministers talk to signal deterrence, but also to signal that we are determined to stick to our principles of collective self-defence.
What you're saying is really in that answer that he's a man living in the past.
I think he's a man looking for a legacy, and I think that all politicians, whether they are democratically elected or not. I've been in politics long enough that when prime ministers and presidents look for legacies, they often do things that either people regret or indeed done at a rush. And I think he is definitely a man looking for a legacy. He has a particular view of the world. He has a view that I don't agree with. I don't agree with his assertion of facts. But nevertheless, he's quite convinced, and a number of the people around him are as well. And so we should engage with him and communicate. We should do what we did in the Cold War, which is be better at transparency and treaties and reassurance measures so that we can take any perception out that he is somehow being surrounded. But fundamentally, we should also be strong as an alliance to stand up to that type of intimidation. And if at the very least, this is a massive exercise in intimidation, that's not something we should be pleased about either, because, the West, I don't know about you, I've spent my life standing up to being bullied, and I don't like the idea of a bully on our eastern flank.
Right. And should we be taking stronger action here in the UK about Russian influence? There's been a lot of criticism about Russian dirty money that comes into this country. Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, has been talking about this, a poison seeping into our system, and says the government's done nothing to stem the flow, has been turning a blind eye. Shouldn't we be taking more action over this to put a firm line in the ground?
Yes, look, I used to be the security minister and the economic crime minister, and I brought in the legislation that gave us many more powers. Some of them we have used, the unexplained wealth orders. We've also used a whole range of measures after Salisbury poisoning. But you are absolutely right, Charlotte, we should do more. We made lots of promises at the time of that bill, which was toughening up Companies House, transparency registers. We've got to do more in that direction. We started it. We've given many powers to law enforcement, such as the National Crime Agency. But you're right, we have to get dirty money out of the city. It's certainly, post-Brexit, our reputation should be for the rule of law and cleanliness. And I think when I spoke to the Prime Minister yesterday, there was a real determination to do more about it.
Can I ask you, while we've got you here, something that's on all the front pages today, which is the news of Prince Andrew's settlement. A lot of talk about it this morning. There's speculation it's going to pave a way for a return to public life for him. Obviously, he had his military roles, his military titles taken away from him, doesn't he? What's your reaction to the news of this settlement, and do you see any way back for him?
Well, I think, first of all, I've just read the extracts of the statement sitting here in Brussels. But look, he clearly has regretted his association with Epstein. I think that's totally the right thing to do. I think the victims coming forward and making the claims was the brave thing and the right thing to do. And he has now made a settlement as a private citizen. And as you rightly said, Charlotte, he's no longer colonels of regiments. And indeed, the palace was quite strong in that statement a few weeks ago. So I think that's where he is at the moment. I think he's done the right thing. And as far as whether he comes back to public life, I think that's a matter for the palace and for himself.
Just very, very briefly, we just touch on your comments to the Sunday Times this week. You talked about the whiff of Munich. You've made it clear that what you meant was you weren't talking about appeasement, which is what happened at Munich in 1938. You were talking about the fact that Hitler lied and said that he had no intention of being an aggressor, and he had a complete plan to be an aggressor. Does that imply that you're calling Putin a liar, briefly?
Well, no, I'd said if he does invade Ukraine, then, of course, what he's been saying all along, he has no plans to invade Ukraine. But we have seen a military plan put into action that is about an invasion. I mean, you don't mass all those troops, point them towards Ukraine for a normal defensive exercise, especially with the type of Western weapon systems that have been deployed. And, there were two parts of the Munich settlement in 1938. One was the appeasement, which, Britain has not been involved in. We've been leading the charge. And in fact, the whole of NATO, to be fair, in many of the powers have actually been firm in holding our principles. But the other part of that Munich was this fact that all along, while Hitler was saying it was only a border dispute, he had a much bigger master plan for invading and taking growing room, I think it was called, for the rest of Europe. And I'd said, if in the end Russia goes into Ukraine, we've all been worrying about the NATO bit, but all along Putin will have actually been ambitious for unifying effectively those two countries, or doing as he'd said in his article in July.
Well,
and I think that.
Sorry, just a quick word as well. I mean, you were talking there about every politician looking towards their legacy. If there were to be a Prime Minister vacancy in the near future at all, is this something you consider? Would you throw your hat in the ring?
I want Boris Johnson to fight the next election. I'm one of the few Secretaries of State who gets the privilege of doing a job he has a background in and always wanted to do. And I can't really see there is any desire for me to do anything other than being the Secretary of State for Defence.
All right. That's kind of the answer we were expecting. Thanks very much for joining us, and all power to everyone's elbow there today in Brussels. We just hope this thing can be stopped.